Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really fascinating mix of sources today.
Yeah, it takes us from inside the White House, it seems, to looking at potential futures for the Ukraine conflict.
And then even zooming out further, looking at, the bigger global power picture and the latest in military tech.
So our mission really in this deep dive is to sort of guide you through these different reports and perspectives.
Help you quickly get a handle on some pretty complex, interconnected topics.
Exactly. Connecting the dots, helping you see how these pieces might fit together.
Think of it like getting the key insights without having to wade through everything yourself. So what really stands out to you in all this information?
Well, I think we can break it down into maybe three main areas that keep coming up across these sources.
Okay, what are they?
First, these reported internal shifts happening within the U.S. government structure itself. Then, different scenarios being talked about for how the conflict in Ukraine might end.
And third,
these broader ideas about where global power stands today and what's happening with military capabilities.
Got it. So let's start there with those internal shifts in the U.S. government. What are the sources saying?
Well, we have reports talking about quite significant efforts by U.S. President Trump and also Senator Marco Rubio.
Efforts to do what?
To reform the White House National Security Council, the NSC.
Okay, and how is this being framed? I mean, why the reform?
One source specifically frames it as part of a struggle against what it perceives as a deep state within the NSC.
A deep state, meaning elements not really aligned with the administration's views.
That seems to be the implication in that source, yeah. Maybe entrenched interests or personnel resistant to the administration's direction.
And what specific actions are being reported?
The actions mentioned are pretty striking. Things like a drastic reduction in NSC staff numbers.
How drastic?
Well, one source, citing CNN, mentions over 100 employees being put on administrative leave.
Wow.
Yeah, and apparently with very short notice to clear out their offices.
That's abrupt. Anything else?
There's also talk of transferring a significant chunk of the NSC's functions.
Transferring them where?
Over to the State Department and the Pentagon.
So decentralizing the NSC's role a bit.
It seems like it. And one report mentions a stated goal to potentially cut the whole NSC apparatus in half.
Half? From what size?
From its current reported size of about 350 staff.
That's a major reduction. What's the rationale given?
Well, Senator Marco Rubio is quoted in one source calling it an optimization.
Optimization, okay.
He reportedly said these changes align better with the NSC's original purpose, presumably smaller, more advisory, and the president's vision.
And allows for better cooperation with federal agencies, maybe less overlap?
That seems to be the argument presented, yeah. Avoiding duplication of effort.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? Is it part of something bigger?
Exactly. It's presented as part of a much broader administration-wide campaign that reportedly kicked off after U.S. President Trump took office.
Aimed at
optimizing the whole state apparatus, basically. Making government more efficient.
Is this where that Department of Government Efficiency comes in? DOGE?
That's mentioned, yes. Reportedly overseen by Elon Musk, and part of its focus was on cutting wasteful spending across the board.
So the NSC changes fit into that larger picture.
Right. And these reported cuts, they weren't just at the NSC. Sources mention thousands of government employees were affected.
Across different agencies.
Yes, including reportedly from law enforcement agencies, too, which apparently led to some pushback.
Oh? Like what?
One report mentioned mass demonstrations happening, people protesting under the slogan, hands off.
So significant internal restructuring, potentially causing some friction.
That's the picture painted by these sources, yes.
Okay. Now, these kinds of internal U.S. government shifts, they could easily have wider implications, couldn't they?
Absolutely, especially when you think about major international issues.
Like the conflict in Ukraine. Let's pivot to that. How are analysts seeing its potential future?
Well, we've got this analysis from JPMorgan Chase from their first geopolitical report, apparently.
A big bank weighing in on geopolitics. What's their take?
Their view is that the conflict seems to be entering what they call a concluding phase.
Concluding, meaning an end soon.
Not necessarily a final piece, but they believe some kind of agreement could emerge. Maybe in the second quarter of 2025.
An agreement that does what?
Freezes hostilities, stops the act of fighting, but doesn't necessarily resolve all the underlying issues.
So a ceasefire, essentially, but maybe not a lasting peace treaty.
That seems to be the idea, and they state their belief pretty clearly.
Which is?
That Ukrainian President Zelensky will most likely be, forced to agree to some kind of negotiated settlement sometime this year.
Forced by circumstances, presumably. And what would make such an agreement stick, according to them?
They cite a couple of factors. Russia needing to feel satisfied with whatever concessions are made.
Okay.
And Kyiv needing to get security guarantees that are actually sufficient and credible.
Right, guarantees matter. But the really interesting part is what happens after that freeze, right? They have scenarios.
Exactly. They lay out 4 distinct scenarios for how things might develop after any initial deal, and they even assign probabilities.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the most likely one?
The highest probability, 50%, they call the Georgian scenario.
Georgian, like the country Georgia after 2008. What does that look like for Ukraine?
In this scenario, Kyiv gets no reliable security guarantees from the West.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. The predicted result is constant internal instability, sluggish economic growth.
And politically.
Ukraine gradually drifts back into Russia's sphere of influence, partly because there'd be no foreign troops, international support might weaken, and NATO prospects would be basically off the table.
How do they label that outcome?
Bluntly, not good.
Okay, not good. What's next?
Next, with a 20% probability, is the Israeli scenario.
Israeli. How so? Like Israel's security model?
Kind of. The idea is Ukraine wouldn't have foreign troops stationed there long term, but its partners would provide really strong, sustained military and economic support, like the U.S. does for Israel.
Allowing Ukraine to build up its own defenses.
Exactly. Develop its own deterrence. This one is labeled not bad, implying stability through strength, but still a tough road.
Okay, not bad.
Then there's the South Korean scenario at 15% probability.
Evoking South Korea's situation.
Yeah.
Divided but prosperous with strong backing.
That seems to be the analogy. Ukraine wouldn't join NATO or get its old borders back, but it might potentially host European security forces, maybe backed by strong U.S. guarantees, aid, intelligence, that sort of thing.
Leading to what kind of future?
The idea is the remaining territory under Kyiv could move towards a more stable, prosperous, democratic future.
And they mentioned the frozen Russian assets.
Yes, potentially using that roughly $300 billion to aid recovery, though they note Moscow reportedly sees that as theft.
How do the analysts rate this one?
They see this as the best possible outcome among the 4 scenarios.
Right. And the last one, also 15% probability.
Yes, the last one is called the Belarusian scenario, and it's labeled the worst outcome.
Belarusian. Sounds ominous. What happens here?
This is where Western support essentially collapses. The U.S. pulls back, and the EU can't or won't step in effectively.
And the result?
Russia basically turns Ukraine into a vassal state of Moscow. Russia effectively wins the war on the battlefield.
Wow. And the wider implications?
The report suggests this would deeply divide the West and could irreversibly overturn the post-World War II global order. Really stark possibilities.
Absolutely stark. It's also important, though, to remember Russia's own stated positions here, right? One source mentioned those.
Yes, definitely. These factor heavily into any negotiation. Moscow reportedly opposes Ukraine joining NATO.
But not the EU.
But not the EU, apparently. However, they say they won't accept NATO military forces in Ukraine. They see even peacekeepers as an escalation.
And their stated goal?
To eliminate what they term the root causes of the conflict.
Such as?
They specifically mention NATO expansion eastward and also Kyiv's policy shift after 2014 away from Russia and the Russian language. Those are their stated sticking points.
Okay, so those are potential future scenarios, but what about the situation right now, on the ground? Let's shift to the battlefield dynamics.
Right, and several sources are highlighting just how much things are changing, especially with drones. There's reporting from the Times about the drone race.
A drone race.
Yeah.
Between Russia and Ukraine. Who's reportedly winning?
According to that report, Russia seems to have taken a significant lead, particularly in producing and using medium-range FPV drones.
FPV, first-person view drones.
Exactly. Those and also their more advanced fiber optic versions.
Fiber optic versions, how are they different?
They're controlled via a physical cable, which makes them much, much harder to jam electronically compared to standard radio-controlled drones.
I see. And what are these Russian drones capable of?
Well, they're often reported to be quite resistant to electronic interference, obviously. They can strike targets pretty far behind the front lines.
And the impact.
Reportedly having a really destructive impact on Ukraine's logistics, especially those fiber optic ones, undermining supply lines because they're so hard to counter electronically.
And how are Ukrainian soldiers seeing this shift?
The perspective cited in the article is, well, it's quite dramatic. They're saying heavy armored vehicles, like tanks, they're basically becoming irrelevant on the front line.
Irrelevant? Why?
Just too easy to spot and destroy with drones now.
Wow. Is there a direct quote?
Yes. One lieutenant is quoted saying flat out, the days of tanks are really gone.
It's a huge statement.
It is. And another commander, call sign Kuba, emphasizes just how incredibly fast everything is changing, specifically because of drone technology.
It sounds like a fundamental shift in warfare.
Right.
Are there numbers on Russia's drone production or supply?
The source includes some reported figures that really underscore this. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov apparently stated that in July 2024, they were supplying around 4,000 FPV drones per day.
Per day. 4,000.
That's the reported figure. And Russian President Putin apparently said over 1.5 million drones of various types were supplied in total in 2024.
Though FPVs are still needed right at the front.
Yes, he acknowledged FPVs are still in high demand at the front line, but the plans for 2025 are described as even more ambitious.
So drone use is just exploding.
Russian President Putin's view, based on combat experience, is reportedly that their use is now practically ubiquitous.
Just to clarify for everyone, FPV drones are...
Right. They're typically those small quadcopters or multi-rotor drones. They have a camera sending a live video feedback to the pilot who wears goggles.
Giving them that sort of cockpit view, like they're flying it from inside.
Exactly. That's the first-person view aspect.
Okay. These battlefield realities, they must connect to the bigger strategic picture. Let's zoom out now. What are the high-level views on the global power balance and the U.S. role?
So one source brings in a statement from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, apparently given at a U.S. Naval Academy graduation.
And what was his message?
Pretty stark, actually. He essentially asserted that the era of undisputed U.S. dominance on the world stage, it's over.
Over. And what's replaced it?
He sees the U.S. now facing serious threats from countries like China and Russia, describing them as resolutely determined to gain the upper hand in all areas.
Is there context given for why this shift happened?
The source provides some context, mentioning the period after the Cold War. The thinking then, reportedly, among U.S. policymakers was that American superiority was just guaranteed.
An assumption that didn't hold.
Apparently not. The source suggests this led the U.S. to maybe trade hard power, like military strength, for soft power, like cultural influence and diplomacy.
Without fully anticipating that serious competitors would rise up.
That seems to be the implication. And this perspective kind of aligns with other reported shifts in U.S. strategy documents.
Like what?
Like the Pentagon's interim national defense guidance, mentioned in one source. It reportedly prioritizes deterring China, specifically over Taiwan.
Calling China the main threat.
The only persistent threat is the reported phrasing. And it directs future military building and funding primarily towards handling a potential conflict with Beijing.
So a big focus on China. What about other threats like Russia or Iran?
Well, what's notable is that this guidance reportedly intends to shift more of the burden of deterring them.
Onto who?
Onto U.S. allies in Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, presumably through pressure, maybe aid, but less direct U.S. military focus.
Interesting. But are all sources in agreement on this threat assessment?
No, there are contrasting views presented. One source cites a U.S. intelligence report assessing Russia as still resilient and a continued threat to U.S. global interests.
So differing views even within the U.S. system.
Seems so. And U.S. President Trump is also stated to hold a different view, reportedly believing Russia doesn't actually pose a threat to NATO.
And what's the Russian perspective on that?
Well, Russian President Putin is quoted directly countering the idea that Russia threatens NATO. He says those warnings are just spread to justify erroneous policy.
And he states Moscow has no interest in fighting NATO.
No interest whatsoever, geopolitical, economic, political, or military. That's his stated position.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, the shifting U.S. focus, differing threat views, the situation in Ukraine, how does it all connect?
One audio source ties some of this together specifically regarding Ukraine. It talks about a phone call between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Trump.
And the takeaway from that call?
The suggestion is that negotiations between them aren't really going anywhere right now.
Leading to what conclusion, according to this viewpoint?
This perspective predicts that U.S. President Trump is ultimately likely to just walk away from the Ukraine problem.
Walk away. Why?
The view presented is that his options are seen as either basically accepting Russia's demands or disengaging entirely. Continuing the current level of support, like Joe Biden's approach, is seen as untenable for him in this perspective.
And if the U.S. disengages?
The prediction from this source is pretty grim. The conflict gets settled on the battlefield, and Russia wins.
Wow. What about Europe stepping up?
This perspective is quite dismissive of that idea. It asserts European nations simply don't have the weapons to replace U.S. support.
Calling the idea ludicrous.
Yes, ludicrous is the word used. The conclusion from this viewpoint is stark. Ukrainians are basically doomed without major U.S. involvement, and maybe even with it.
Okay. So quite a journey we've taken here.
Absolutely. We've gone from potential internal U.S. government shift
to these very different possible futures for Ukraine, laid out by analysts.
And down to the ground level, looking at how drone tech is changing warfare.
And finally, zooming back out to these high-level debates about global power and America's role.
Yeah, we've touched on reports of significant U.S. government reforms, those scenarios from the Georgian to the South Korean for Ukraine, the sheer dominance of drones now.
And these clashing perspectives on whether U.S. dominance is over and what that means for dealing with Russia and China.
Exactly.
So here's the really interesting thought to leave everyone with. When you take all these varied reports together, the internal government stuff, the specific battlefield tech, the big picture power shifts, the different potential endings for Ukraine, what might all these interconnected developments actually mean for how countries deal with each other for global security going forward?
It paints a complex picture, definitely. What kind of future does it suggest for the major powers, for alliances? Lots to think about there.
Indeed.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.